Welcome to the How to Program with Java podcast, where all you need is the desire to learn, and you too can become a Java programmer with absolutely no knowledge of programming. And now, your host, Trevor Page.
Hey guys, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. How you doing? How's it going? Welcome to episode number 55 of the How to Program with Java podcast. As always, as the man with a booming voice mentioned, my name is Trevor Page, and welcome to the show. Welcome to this episode. It's been a little while since I've recorded one because I've been away on vacation. If you guys are following up to date with these episodes and listened to the last one, you will have heard that I was going away to New York, at least New York State. And so I went away. I had a lovely vacation. It was just so good to unplug and just to relax. And the scenery was beautiful. There was, surrounded by mountains. And actually, I have a little bit of news. I actually took my girlfriend and took her up a mountain, and I actually proposed to her. And believe it or not, she said yes. So that's pretty big news in my life. I am now affianced. I have a fiancé. So that's incredible. I mean, I'm so lucky to have found this lady who's in my life. We've been dating for just over, I think, 3.5 years now. So it was time. But yeah, I figured I would share that momentous occasion with you all because I'm very, very excited. We're both very happy and looking forward to probably tying the knot in the next year or so. I shouldn't say or so. We're planning on next summer to tie the knot. So into wedding planning mode we go. Hopefully that won't screw up my podcast schedule. But in any case, good news all around. And I can't wait to get into the content for today. I hurriedly wrote up the whole blog post, the whole show notes page around this topic that we're going to be talking about today, and I'm very excited to get through it because we're getting closer to the part where I get to really share a lot of real cool and advanced tips in the Hibernate framework. So that's essentially what we're going to be talking about today is going to be an extension of last week. We were talking about the bidirectional one-to-many relationships in Hibernate and how to map it out and how to make it work. So this week we're going to be focusing on the one-to-one relationship, and I'm going to be hitting you with both the unidirectional and the bidirectional relationship and how to map those out. So first and foremost, before we get the ball rolling with the content, I want to talk about, of course, the 5-star reviews that have come in. So in looking at the records, it looks like 2 came in, which is great. 2 5-star reviews, both from the United Kingdom. So this particular week, the UK is representing. First one is from the username Cisco. What is it? Cisco Pig? Cisco Puig? I'm not sure how to pronounce it. They say, as an IT developer and student, it's a great resource to have access to these podcasts. They provide useful information and very, very well explained on how the Java language works, and very useful to other programming languages in general as well. Thank you very much. Cool. Excellent review. Thank you for leaving that for me. And the second one's a little bit lengthy, but it's a good one. This one comes in also, like I said, from the UK, from a username, I think, Davros 1973. They started off with an LOL, and they say, Trevor can waffle a bit. I'm not sure what waffle means. I don't have the UK lingo down, but hopefully that's not a terrible thing. Apparently I waffle a bit, and says awesome frequently. Yes, I do like to say the word awesome. They say it's noticeable when listening a few times to the same podcast or viewing a video a few times. Force a habit, deal with it. I love to say awesome because that's just a reflection of my life. In any case, they say, I have found his combination of podcast, blog, ebook, and video tutorials an incredible resource to provide a solid supporting foundation for not just learning the Java language, but complementary technologies, tools, business practices, and terminology. I supplement his materials with many others on the net, but use his as a pacemaker and a guide. His confidence and refreshing honesty is inspiring. It keeps me going when so many priorities and life pressures threaten to fetter my enthusiasm. I'm hoping this time I can make the difficult jump from the diminished and starved skill set and tattered hobby to a career in something I actually love doing and am naturally talented in. If I ever succeed in this, I'll be sure to thank Trevor for his significant contribution. I mean, those kinds of reviews, like, doesn't get any better than that. Personally, the way I think about it, like, to be able to help someone out like that and to take them from, I love the vocabulary that this particular, I assume it would be a gentleman because that's typically, most programmers are male, but if it's a female, then so be it. My apologies. But I love the language that they use here in terms of describing the skill set. What do they say? Diminished, starved skill set and tattered hobby to a career. In any case, I think it's completely possible for anybody to take, as long as they have a desire to learn, which is exactly what it says in the intro. As long as you have that desire, you can become a programmer. I really, truly believe that. It just takes some work, some hard work, some persistence, and a good teacher, a good guide. So I'm very privileged to be in a spot where I can provide that kind of support and be the beacon, the the pacemaker and guide for you guys and for everyone out there. So that's awesome. So thank you very much for the reviews. Always a great thing for me to wake up to one of these 5-star reviews. And if you want to leave one for me and put a smile on my face, then please, by all means, go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/love, LOVE, and you can spread the love, share the love, and I will read your 5-star review at the top of the next episode. Without further ado, let's make it happen. So one-to-one relationships. Let's start with the unidirectional because that's that's step 1 in our learning process. So hopefully you guys have already listened to the topics on how to do the one-to-many and the unidirectional one-to-many and the bidirectional one-to-many. Hopefully you remember how to do that, and hopefully you also remember how to do a one-to-one relationship in general. So just to sort of refresh your memory, a one-to-one relationship is a direct, mapping relationship between a parent and a child table where the parent has a primary key. Let's say, the example that I'm using in this one is going to be employees and employee addresses. Okay. So we have an employee, and an employee has one address and only one address. And what we do is we take the employee ID, which is the primary key of the parent table, because it's on the left-hand side of the one-to-one relationship. It's on the employee table. We take the employee ID, and we make that not only the foreign key in the child table, the address table, but we also make it the primary key of the address table. Now, I've talked about this before. Hopefully you remember this, but it's, like I said, it's never hurts to refresh the memory. If you don't remember how to do this, you can go back to the episode where I talk about one-to-one relationships. That's certainly where you can learn about this stuff more in depth if you forget. But yeah, the whole point is to restrict the ability to have more than one essentially address that points back to the same employee. So at most you can have one, or you can even have 0 in the child table. So the parent maps to either 0 or 1 entries in the child table, which is from employee to address. All right. So, in the real world, you can often have more than one address. This is just a scenario that I decided to work with, an example I decided to work with. In real life, you can have a mailing address and a billing address and all these different things. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that in this system, whatever system we could be applying this to, the requirement is that an employee can only have one address. Okay, no ifs, ands, or buts. That's it. They can only have, at most, one address. So that's what we're doing. One-to-one. Beautiful stuff. All right, so how do we do a unidirectional relationship with one-to-one mapping inside of Hibernate? And again, to refresh your memory, a unidirectional relationship means that the relationship only goes one way. It only goes typically from the child table to the parent table. So like I said, the child table in this case is the address table, okay? Employees to address. We know it's a child table because we can have an employee who potentially can have no address. At least that's the requirement that I'm setting, or that we're sort of assuming is going on in our system. So since that's the case, you can have an employee that could exist, but they could potentially have 0 or 1 addresses. Then that makes sense. That's the parent to child relationship. Think about it the other way around. Can you have an address without an employee? Does that make sense? Can someone not exist in the system yet still have an address? Okay, well, that doesn't really make sense. Since we're mapping employees to addresses, it doesn't make sense. If there's no employee, then clearly there's going to be no address. So that's how we sort of establish the concept of which is the parent and which is the child in this particular scenario. So how do we map out, like I said, the unidirectional relationship? Well, it's all about using our, obviously, our annotations, right? There's, just like we used the one-to-many and the many-to-one annotation in the last 2 episodes, this one, with probably no surprise to you, we're going to be using the one-to-one annotation, which is just at one-to-one, spelled out, O-N-E-T-O-O-N-E, all one word, one-to-one. Beautiful. But how do we do this? It's going to be a little bit more tricky, and the one-to-one relationship is a little bit more tricky just because of the fact that the child table has this special property. The child table, as its primary key, has a foreign key. Okay, that's kind of a special property of one-to-one, the one-to-one relationship. All right. So how do we map this out? How do we enforce this relationship? Well, we do this obviously by using Hibernate and by using some annotations that Hibernate provides to us. But let's start with step 1. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create our address table. We need to create our address object. Okay. So we can create our public class address. We need to remember to make it to annotate the whole class with the @entity annotation because it's going to be an entity object, which means we're going to have a database table that sort of is the backing table for this particular class. And we need to create our instance variables. So the first one is going to be an employee ID, because like I said, we don't want to put an address ID inside of the address table, because then we're looking at more of a one-to-many relationship if we do it that way. We only want the one-to-one relationship, so we have to use the employee ID as being the primary key of the address table. So we'll create the employee ID. And then, like in any relationships in Java with our Hibernate mapping, we need to have a reference to the actual object itself that we're going to be dealing with. So what that means is, inside of the address object, we need to have a reference to employee. Because like I said, it's a one-to-one relationship between employee and address. And since we're doing a unidirectional relationship, it goes from child to parent. The child in this case is the address table. So the child will hold the reference to the parent object. So inside of the address class, we are going to hold a reference to the employee class, child to parent. Makes sense? Cool. So we'll have the employee reference, which is just going to be private, employee object, and give it a name. I just call it employee with lowercase e. Good, great, grand. Now what else do we need? Well, this is an address object, so we need details that obviously correspond to an address functionality. So we need to have street address, city, region, zip code, and country. Okay, so fair enough. And I say region because I've said this before. There can be either a province or a state or what have you. So I just make it generic and say region. But I don't know what a generic zip code is, because in Canada we have postal codes, not zip codes, and I'm sure there's plenty of other types of codes that we have to identify regions. I guess I could have called it a region code. That might have made sense, but I called it a zip code because I like to be inconsistent, apparently. So, all right, so we create all those fields. That's nothing special about these. These are just standard instance variables that we've done a million times already. And like we have done also a million times, we'll create the getters and setters for every single one of these instance variables. Okay, so now comes the fun stuff. So now we need to actually map out our relationship. So as you may have guessed, we use the @one-to-one annotation, just like we would have used in the last or 2 episodes ago when we did the unidirectional one-to-many relationship. We use the @many-to-one annotation. So in this case, we're going to use the @one-to-one annotation, and we're going to put it on the getter method for the employee object. Okay, and this is where things can get a little bit tricky because you might not know which one to put it on. You might want to put the one-to-one relationship on the employee ID field, but that would be wrong. You don't want to do that. Remember, the relationships always correspond with the actual objects that we're dealing with. Okay, we don't want to put the one-to-one relationship on the ID. We want to put it on the object. So that's why we're putting the one-to-one annotation over the get employee method. Okay, and just like we've done before, I just put a cascade in there. So I say cascade equals cascade type dot all. So it just means cascade all different things, and inserts, deletes, updates, etc. Just because usually that helps to maintain a good integrity in your database. If you have a situation where you wouldn't want it to cascade, then obviously you can omit that as you see fit. Now, fair enough. That's obviously not the end of it, though, because this is a bit more confusing. Because, like I said, we need to handle this situation where the primary key is not just a randomly generated number anymore. Okay, I'm not sure. I might have started down this train of thought and then I got sidetracked and went somewhere else. I apologize if I did do that. But the situation here is we want the primary key of the address table, which is, like I said, the foreign key that points to the employee ID of the parent table. We want this not to be randomly generated number. We want this to be a very specific number. This number has to correspond to the parent object. So how in the heck are we going to do that? Well, there's sort of two different steps, or maybe even three different steps that we need to address. The first one is staying with the getEmployee method. So this is where we've already put our @OneToOne annotation. We need to also include an annotation called the join column annotation. We need to map out the join column because otherwise, because we have, we want to name it this what is called the primary key of this table to be employee underscore ID. Okay, employee ID. It's not going to use that particular naming convention. It's going to name it without the underscore. And if you don't specify the join column explicitly and say, look, this is what I want it to be called, it's going to create two different keys, one called employee underscore ID and one called employee ID without the underscore. And I'm not exactly sure why Hibernate does that. I'm sure there's a very reasonable explanation, but I didn't want to get into the nitty gritty there because really it's you just need to know that you need to put the join column annotation along with the @OneToOne annotation when you're creating a one-to-one relationship. So you create the @join column annotation, slap it on the getEmployee getter method, and just give it a name. So the name equals employee ID because we're telling it what the join column should be called. Again, the join column is the key, the foreign key that points back to our parent table. Okay, there's nothing special going on here. It's just our join column. That's what Hibernate, the terminology Hibernate uses to refer to this particular property, this particular column. Okay. So there we go. So now we're done with the getEmployee method. So that handles the actual relationship with our parent object. Good. But now, like I said, we need to handle this this generation of the primary key. Because if we leave it as is, it's not going to generate the proper IDs for this particular field, the primary key of this child table. It's not going to create the right key. And they're not going to be aligned. The two of them are not going to be pointing to each other properly. So that would cause a huge mess. You would have employees pointing to the wrong addresses. You'd probably have employees pointing to no addresses. It would just be havoc. So how the heck do we do this? Well, just like normal, we have to annotate the employee ID getter method with an @ID annotation because we still want it to be the ID of the table. That doesn't change. So we still use that same annotation, just like we have before. And also, just like we have before, we want to include the @GeneratedValue annotation. Okay? However, inside of the @GeneratedValue annotation, normally we would have given it a strategy. So we would have said strategy is to auto-generate the keys. But now we don't want to assign the strategy here because we want to create our own custom generator for this key, which makes sense. We want to have a custom generator of the primary key because this is a one-to-one relationship and there's special rules that go along with the one-to-one relationship. So let's forget about the generated value annotation for now. Okay, so let's stick with what we know. So we put the @ID annotation. Let's skip generated value, and let's go into how to create this custom generator thing that we're going to create that's going to be able to properly hook up our parent object with our child object. How do we do that? Well, there's yet another annotation that we can use called @GeneRicGenerator. So we're gonna have create a generic generator. I would have preferred they called it custom generator, but hey, whatever. Generic generator it is. So that's what we're going to be using. So we use @generic generator, and then we need to give it a name. So we need to name it whatever the heck we like to name it. Okay. Some people just call it generator. In my example that you'll see in the show notes, I call it my generator. But you can call it employee ID generator if you like. You can call it whatever you want. No big deal there. It's kind of like a variable name. Next thing we do is we need to also identify the strategy. So like I said before, we would identify the strategy as being something like auto. But in this case, we don't want to set it to auto because we know exactly what strategy we want to use here. And that is the foreign strategy, which obviously refers to the foreign key strategy. Because that's exactly what this primary key is going to be. It's going to be a foreign key. So we use a strategy and we set it equal to foreign. Okay. Again, you'll see in the show notes if you go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/session55, you'll see exactly the code I'm talking about. Set the strategy equal to foreign, and the final thing, which is a little bit confusing, but the final step is to set the parameters of this generic generator. So what you do is you say parameters equals. And then, unfortunately, you need to use yet another annotation, which is kind of a funky looking syntax. But once you look it over a few times and understand what's going on here, it sort of makes sense. You say parameters equals, and then you use an @parameter annotation and assign of the value of it to be employee, because that's the object that you're dealing with in this particular. That's the field you're dealing with, the instance variable you are dealing with inside of this object, the address object. So you're pointing it to the employee object, okay, which is essentially the pointer to the parent object. And you set the name of this to be property, okay, because it's the property that you're dealing with. You're setting the property equal to being the employee object. So essentially, you are creating a generic generator that is going to be a foreign strategy. It's going to use a foreign key strategy, and we're pointing it to our employee object, saying this is the object that we want to be, using the magic on. So we want to get the key, the foreign key from this particular object. So you're pointing it to there and saying that's the one that I want to use. Okay. Again, you'll be able to see this code. It never translates well over audio, but check it out. howtoprogramwithjava.com/session55. You'll see how to do it. It's wonderful. So now let's go back to the last step of this process, however you like to pronounce it, and let's go back to the @GeneratedValue annotation. So the @GeneratedValue is the annotation that we used previously in the past two episodes when we were assigning our strategy to our keys, our primary keys and foreign keys. Okay, in this case, what we do is we still need to set the generated value. It still needs to know how to generate the key for this table. But what we do is, instead of setting the strategy equal to auto, we say generator equals, and then we give it the name of the generic generator that we just created. So if you remember, I named it my generator. And I said you can name it whatever you like. You can name it generator or employee ID generator, whatever the heck you like. But you just need to be consistent. So since I named it my generator, that's exactly what I'm going to put inside of the generated value annotation. I'm going to say generator equals my generator. So then, logically speaking, it says, okay, here's the primary key. How the heck do I generate values? Oh, it wants me to point to a specific generator, which is a generic generator called my generator. It'll point to the annotation you just created. It says, oh, okay, it's a foreign key strategy, and the value that I'm pulling from as a foreign key is going to be from the employee object, which is what we've set as the parameter inside of our @generic generator annotation. Okay, it's very convoluted, but it makes a perfect sense once you fully understand all the bells not the bells and whistles, the cogs and whatever the expression is. It makes perfect sense on how this stuff works. So, and that's it. That's as complicated as I'm going to give it to you. That's as complicated as it gets with the one-to-one relationship. Even if you don't really super understand, is that a good terminology to use? If you don't. What would be a good terminology to use? If you don't fully understand what I'm saying, you can always copy, paste, and tweak it and fiddle with it and learn about it that way. Again, go to the show notes, howtoprogramwithjava.com/session 55. You'll see exactly, it's almost right near the top of the page, the actual code I use for the address class. Whew. Okay, so there you go. That's essentially the one-to-one unidirectional relationship and how you map it out inside of Hibernate. Okay, we can call our job done there. Beautiful. But now how do you actually make it save the value? Well, just like before when we were talking about the unidirectional one-to-many relationship, when you're doing the saving there, when you're creating the object and actually persisting it with your code inside of, we used a controller inside of your controller code. What you do is you create the child class, you instantiate it. So in this case, it'd be the address. You set all the values appropriately that should be set inside of the address class, and you invoke a save on the address class. Although obviously that wasn't part of the one-to-many. I think the many, I forget what example we had used, but that's exactly what we're going to be doing here. You need to you invoke the save on the child object. Okay, when you have unidirectional, you invoke the save on the child. So our child is the address table. So you just invoke the constructor for the address. You actually instantiate it. You would set the street address, the city, the region, the country, the zip code, and also you would set the employee. Okay, because remember, the address points to the employee object. The child points to the parent. So you need to set that relationship. So we set the employee on the address class. The one curveball here is you might be wanting to set the employee ID as well, because technically you might already know the employee ID if you had created an employee previously and it is already saved in the system. You might also be tempted to do that, but I warn you, if you do that, it probably won't work, because what happens is, again, with Hibernate, if you manually set the primary key of an object and invoke a save, Hibernate assumes that object already exists with that primary key, and it will assume that you're doing an update on this object. All right, this is the problem I actually ran into when I was doing this code and doing it up and trying it out. I couldn't figure out why the heck it wasn't working, and then I realized it was invoking an update, and I said, oh, that's right, because I was setting the employee ID on the address object. So that's a no-no. Don't do that. Only set the employee object, not the ID, if you are indeed creating a new object and it needs to be a new field in your database, a new row in your database. So don't set the employee ID, just the employee reference, and then you save the child object, which is the address table or the address object, and you're good to go. It'll save it, and you'll see it'll map perfectly to the parent object, which is the employee object, and you will be laughing. Cool? Cool. All right, so now we go on into the one-to-one bidirectional relationship. Thankfully, this is a lot more straightforward. Once you understand and have implemented a unidirectional one-to-one relationship, the bidirectional is quite simple. It's quite straightforward. So just like we did done with the bidirectional one-to-many relationship, if you remember that, what we have to do is we go into the parent class now. So in this case, it's the employee class. And we need to put in a reference for the child object. So right now, as it stands, since it's a unidirectional relationship that we had just created, there is no reference to the child object inside of the parent. There's only the reference the other way around. We have the parent object inside of the child. So now we're going to put the child object inside of the parent, which means we put the address reference, which is going to be an instance variable. We put the address inside of the employee class. So we'll say private address with an uppercase A and then address with lowercase a. That's our name for it. And we create the getter and setter. All right. So now, give you a wild guess as to what you need to do here. If you remember from the last episode, you'll probably have a decent idea of what you need to do. But it obviously, the code that we need to put in goes into the get address part of the code. You need to put it on the getter method. So what is it that we're putting there? Well, if you remember with our one-to-many situation, when we had the unidirectional one-to-many, we had the at many-to-one annotation on the child object, and then when we moved to the bidirectional, we put the at one-to-many annotation on the parent object. So it's the same thing going on here. It's just that it's the same name that we use for both, because one-to-one, you flip it around, it's still one-to-one. So you're going to put a one-to-one annotation onto the getAddress method. The difference here is, and again, this is the same as last time, we need to say how it is mapped. So we need to tell Hibernate what object we use, what we call the object, so that it knows how to go into the child class and find how to map these two things together. Okay? If you don't tell it how it's mapped, then remember it does that weird scenario where it creates a join table. At least I think that's what it was. It creates a join table and it puts the values in there, and it also puts the foreign key in the child object, and it's kind of like having two different mappings, and it's just very ugly, very bad. So you need to remember to not only put the @one-to-one annotation on the getter method of the address class or the child class inside of your parent class. Inside the one-to-one annotation, you need to put mapped by is equal to whatever the name of the object was, the instance variable was that you put inside of the child class. So in this case, the child class, which is address, points to the parent class, which is employee, using the variable name employee with a lowercase e. So that's exactly what we're going to put in the parent class. So we're going to say @one-to-one, we're going to say mapped by equals employee. Okay, and then don't forget you also put the cascade in there. That's always useful to have your cascades good to go. All right, so that's it. That's the extent of the work that you need to do to turn this into a bidirectional relationship, except for if you have already written your code for how to actually persist this object. So when you're persisting this object, when you're saving this object into your database with actual code, most likely in your controller, or I shouldn't say most likely in your controller, but wherever the code is that you're using to save the object, you need to switch it around. So there's a couple things that you need to do, and again, you can follow the exact same template as I had laid out in the last episode. You need to instantiate your parent. You need to instantiate your child. You need to set everything on the parent and set everything on the child. But on the child, you set the reference to the parent, just like we had done in the unidirectional relationship. But then you also need to set the child into the parent. Does that make sense? Is that what we just did? We set the parent into the child, and now we also need to set the child into the parent. So we need to do address.setEmployee, and we need to do employee.setAddress. Okay, they both need to point to each other properly because it's a bidirectional relationship. If you do not have, inside of a bidirectional relationship, if you do not have both of the objects pointing to each other, it's not going to save it correctly. Okay, so don't forget that. That is a critical step. Luckily, with the one-to-one relationship, you don't have to deal with sets or anything like that, like we had talked about in the one-to-many. This is just, since it's a one-to-one, they're just straight up object to object, and you are good to go. So you make sure you set them both. And then you invoke the save on the parent object. Okay, so in this case, you have the address.setEmployee, you have employee.setAddress, and then you say save on the employee object, which is the parent object. Okay, and in the case of the code, I had created an employee DAO object to invoke the save. All right, and that's really all there is to it. Then you are good to go. You have successfully implemented a one-to-one relationship, both a unidirectional and a bidirectional relationship, using Hibernate. How cool is that? Okay, there's a lot of content there, a lot of stuff that I just taught to you. Again, it's tough over audio to fully imagine how this stuff looks. So again, I will urge you to check out the show notes page, howtoprogramwithjava.com/session 55. All right, session 55. Sound good? Sounds good. So as always, while you're there, while you're checking out the show notes and going over my lovely, beautiful show notes that give you lovely, beautiful explanations on how you can implement this code, like today's topic, the one-to-one relationships. You can also subscribe to the newsletter, my email list, if you will. So you'll be able to get information about when these shows go live. I'll be sure to let you guys know when I put up new videos, any new content at all. I'll be emailing you, letting you know. And also, when you subscribe, at first, you'll be able to get immediate access to the top 7 tools that Java programmers use every day. I think, like I said before, 85% of those are free to use, which is why it's so cool to be a programmer. Lots of free tools. I'm sure at this point you know mostly what tools to use, but there might be a tidbit or two of cool things that you can get in there that you might not already have installed on your computer. So check it out. Get subscribed to the email list, and we can call it a win-win scenario. Cool? Otherwise, if you're not able to sign up for the email list, and you can probably see at the very top, you'll be able to click, because I will be perhaps promoting my next webinar or workshop, whatever you want to call it, where I'll be teaching the up-to-date, cool lessons that you guys have voted for, that you guys have said that you want to learn about. I'm not sure when the next one is going to be. I'm actually busy doing something that's actually quite exciting. If you're on the email list, you would have seen an exciting announcement. Maybe that'll be a good hint for you guys to actually hop on there. There's a new thing coming in the future, and it's going to be pretty exciting stuff. So I'm going to be quite busy and quite involved with that. But once that's done, then I'm sure I'll be getting back into the swing of things with the workshops and the webinars and whatnot. So hop on over there, show notes page, howtoprogramwithjava.com/session55. See you there, or be a square. Peace out, guys. Wish you the very best. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to the How to Program with Java podcast. Please visit howtoprogramwithjava.com for more useful Java tutorials.